with that, we have Grayson, who is of the evolution persuasion.
Okay.
And Grayson's been here several times now for formal debates. I've debated him a couple times at least. He's debated Kent Hovind, and he has some debates scheduled in the future. So Grayson, thanks for joining the open mic discussion. And why don't you give yourself a real quick introduction and then present a challenge or objection or a question to David McQueen.
Hey all, I'm driving, so hope there's not too much background noise, but I haven't been able to hear the entire talk so far. I was just gonna ask, I guess, one of the big questions that I have with a lot of these flood models, like I was gonna ask Kent the next time that we had a talk, but one of the things that is my biggest question is just how to explain the order that we find in like the fossil record from like, you know, the more complex organisms on top and the less complex organisms toward the bottom, and we see these ordered layers of different organisms, and you know it all seems very, you know, sorted. So what is the explanation in the global flood model creationist view for this like sorting of the fossil record that we observe?
Grayson, first and most importantly, I want to wish you Merry Christmas, and I thank you so much for being part of this debate with the spontaneity of the driving. Be sure to turn your headlights up to bright, because some of the things I tell you may shock you. I don't want you to wreck or anything like that. Little bit of driving humor there. Your question is a very important one, and one that I've thought about for 40 years. And so let's look at this whole issue of the fossil record. And what I'm going to do, Grayson, is I'm going to draw a cross section that John Woodmoraphy, or Jan Peskus is his real name, the fellow that's been a friend of mine going back 30 years at least. He has found one area in the country of Morocco, in the Atlas Mountains. And so here is here's Morocco in northwest Africa. And there is a place there that you can begin in what the evolutionary community calls Precambrian. And you can walk up the side of this mountain, apparently. For those of you that need a refresher on this, carry out some dinner, Miss Penny Pearl, Cambrian, Ordovician, Silurian, Devonian, Mississippian, Pennsylvanian, Permian. And then you keep on going and you find two Johnny Clock, Triassic, Jurassic, Cretaceous with a K, and then you find modern, even what a flood geologist would consider modern rocks there. And so in the study that we have done, this is the only place on Earth that you really can walk up from the Cambrian through the Paleozoic, Mesozoic, Cenozoic. So let's use this as an example, because this would be a perfect place to prove the truth of evolutionary science. Well, as you go, and I haven't done it yet, but some of my buddies have, as you walk this outcrop, it is true that, and then I'll draw it in a more traditional way, in the Cambrian rocks, you really do find trilobites. Cambrian, Ordovician, Silurian, Devonian. In the Devonian rocks here, you really do find fish fossils. And then you keep going up, and at a certain point, you encounter dinosaur bones or dinosaur graveyards up here, Triassic, Jurassic, and Cretaceous. Now, as a flood geologist, I didn't draw that very well. This is Devonian and Cambrian. What we see here is what is called what's come to be called over the years ecological zonation, habitat zonation, where if the flood occurred, we would expect, as the floodwaters ran off that one world continent, a geologist would expect things like trilobites and fish, gastropods, plesiopods to be buried first. And then as the flood proceeded and the waves went for that 12-month period, they would then capture the creatures that could escape the longest, like dinosaurs, and then finally man. Keep in mind that one of the mysteries that I continue to look into is why we do not find routinely where we find dinosaur fossils. Why don't we find dinosaurs, elephants, and man all jumbled together? I don't have a quick explanation for that, but Grayson, for the audience that's listening to our discussion here, that's actually a very important point, isn't it? If I'm trying to do science and you're trying to do science, there are certain things that you cannot explain, like how these fossils appear abruptly and fully formed. And there are certain things I can't explain, like the absence of human fossils. What do you think, Grayson?
Well, I do agree that your model maybe can't explain those things, but I do think that we have an explanation for the things that you said that we don't, like the Cambrian explosion and such. But I one last thing while we're talking about the sorting, you were talking about how it could be different habitats or different like mobility strategies, but
Yes.
what I wanted to bring up was plankton fossils, which would be all living in the same habitat, right? Like phytoplankton in the first few meters of the Earth's surface where they can get sun. They would all the different types of phytoplankton would be occupying the same kind of ecological niche. They would be all kind of the same density, the same kind of complexity in body structures, the same ability to be mobile, like pretty much the same kind of properties. I don't know how you distinguish different types of phytoplankton, but they are distinguished in the order that we find them in the fossil record. Again, going from this more complex and more diverse different types of specimens of phytoplankton towards the top layers, and then more basal and less complex and less derived specimens at further down layers. So I don't know how the sorting of specifically plankton, because same amount of intelligence, same habitat, same everything along the distinguishing characteristics for flood sorting. So how could we explain the specific ordering of like plankton fossils? And then if you want to talk about like the Cambrian explosion and those kinds of topics, I'm open to that discussion as well, because I think that stuff is really interesting. The short answer, what I would just point to, is that the Ediacaran fossils clearly show, like, that things are not just popping up out of complete nowhere in the Cambrian.
Okay, let's start, Grayson, with your phytoplankton argument. And you and I really, in February or March, should have a debate, just you and me, because the points you bring up are important. Let me use an example from the Gulf of Mexico. If this is the delta of the Mississippi River, I live about here, 5 hours north of New Orleans. But I've spent quite a bit of time studying from my University of Tennessee days. I got my undergraduate degree in 74 there, and then went on to Michigan in 79. In those years, I studied the issues of the Gulf of Mexico. And let me give you a counter argument that comes from one of my University of Tennessee professors, who was a very aggressive evolutionist, someone who had no interest, zero interest in my creationist views, and there's a story behind that. But his name was Dr. Walker. And Dr. Walker was my stratigraphy professor. And he told us this that has stuck with me over the last 40 years. He said, McQueen, if you go to the Gulf of Mexico and you look at phytoplankton and foraminifera going down the column, and I'll simplify this into three parts here. This will be the surface of the Gulf of Mexico, and we'll call this Unit 1, Unit 2, and Unit 3. If you look at these rock units, it is true that you find phytoplankton, that I'll use a P for here, and it's true that you find foraminifera, and there are different kinds. Geologists that have worked in the petroleum industry in the Gulf of Mexico have found for years that if you go down about 1,000 feet and you follow a certain type of foram, many times you'll find crude oil below that unit. Well, here was Dr. Walker's take on that. He said, gentlemen, in my class, I'm telling you that these forams and these phytoplanktons might as well be screws and bolts and paper clips. This is coming from an evolutionary geologist with a degree from Yale. He said, as far as the evolutionary side of this goes, there's no clear evolution of these forams. There's no clear evolution of this phytoplankton, like Grayson's saying. It might as well be a group of screws, bolts, and nuts and so forth that you find there for all the evolutionary significance they have. So it is true that about 1,000 feet down, you find a bunch of forams and phytoplankton that are like screws. And then underneath that, you find some others that are like nuts. And then underneath that, you find paper clips. And over the years that the Gulf has been drilled, going back 70 years to the 50s at least, and then back into the 40s, as they worked offshore, pragmatically, they have used these fossils to identify crude oil areas. I'm guessing you don't like that argument, Grayson.
Well, I'm not sure how up to date that argument is. I mean, you were saying that this professor was saying these things back in the 70s, if I heard you correctly. And
oh yeah, he was. It was in the 70s that he got his doctorate, I think.
Well, I think that the field has progressed a lot since then, in 50 years intervening. I mean, for example, the period preceding the Cambrian explosion, the Ediacaran was only became an official named period in geological history in 2004 or something. So a lot of our knowledge about Precambrian fossils was most developed in the 90s and the early 2000s, and we started to re-examine a lot of the fossilized fauna that we had from that period, and seeing the similarities that they had with later life, like trilobites or those kinds of things, and just in comparison with the body forms, and seeing the great diversification and flourishing of life that we see in the Ediacaran period.
Let me suggest to the audience that are listening to our debate here that Grayson may be committing a logical fallacy that I've seen among a number of younger scientists like him. Just because something's old doesn't mean it's wrong. I mean, if I understand Grayson's philosophical viewpoint, he thinks that Darwin in 1859 came upon a very clever idea about natural selection. So just because something's old, even in the evolutionary community, doesn't mean it's wrong. But let me give some defense to this based on the Ediacaran fauna in the Lower Cambrian. In about 1976, a scientist named Preston Cloud came to the University of Michigan to give us a lecture about the Ediacaran that he had been studying in southwest Canada, I guess. And he talked about these very interesting jellyfish fossils, and he had some ideas of some trilobite precursors that he felt he could trace into the Cambrian. And so I raised my hand. This was a brown bag discussion. Back in those days, I was a National Science Foundation graduate fellow, so I had some clout in the department. They didn't understand how a Southern boy like me even got that scholarship, but they gave me some leeway. And so I asked Preston Cloud about this whole transition from the Ediacara up into the Cambrian. And I asked him questions like, how come the trilobites that are found in that part of Canada appear abruptly and fully formed? Well, he fumbled around with some answers. And one of my favorite professors, Eric Cassine, has now passed away. And he was my metamorphic petrology professor, quite a friend of mine. He came up to me afterwards. He said, McQueen, I've got to caution you. I know you're a Christian. You got to think about these Friday seminars as kind of like Sunday school. You don't embarrass the Sunday school teacher by asking questions like that. You find that humorous, Grayson?
I don't really know exactly how to respond to that, other than just the fact that, like, Cambrian trilobites are hard-bodied animals. So I mean, they have like shells or things that would fossilize easily.
But you do know the name Preston Cloud.
Let me just finish this sentence really quick. But in the Ediacaran period, we know that the fossils that we're finding are much rarer because they're from soft-bodied organisms. So like the paucity in fossils would make sense because they're only forming under much rarer conditions that would trap soft-bodied creatures and cause them to make impressions that would then become fossils. So it's like a slightly different between the hard-bodied animals that we see evolving in the Cambrian. So that would be an explanation for what you're saying is this sudden appearance out of nowhere would be the development of these more hard shell forms.
Well, I did mention jellyfish, and the issue that you brought up, I think you should communicate with Donnie between now and the first of the year, and let you and I set up a debate in February or March and tackle some of these questions. Now, tell me a bit about your background. Are you a geologist, Grayson?
No, I'm not. But yeah, I am really interested in discussing this question of sorting. I wasn't exactly satisfied with the explanation for the photoplankton. And then I also just have the question of course, where are all of the humans in the flood layers that we see these dinosaurs and these Cambrian fossils and all of them in? We never find any humans in those layers. So where would that be? Because shouldn't we find them if isn't that would be in your model?
And in your critique there, if it really is true that there were 1 billion people or even 100 million people, one would think that we would find more human fossils. An Australian colleague of mine named John Mackay has tried to do research on a human fossil that was apparently found in the Western Hemisphere that ended up in the basement of the British Museum, fossilized. If you look at old photographs of the British Museum in the pre-Darwinian days, 1820, 1830, 1850, this was on prominent display as a human killed during the time of the Great Flood. And so I can point to one or two examples, even one that I did some research on in Peru back in 1997. So there are one or two examples that I can point to, but your critique is quite challenging. Um, how come, since those of us that are flood geologists have been looking at this since 1700, how come we haven't found more of these worldwide? It's a legitimate critique.
Could you mention the first example that you mentioned, something about the British Museum with a human fossil that was found and displayed before Darwin? But then, so are you alleging like there's like a conspiracy to like suppress this human fossil, or
Well,
has it been renamed, or like is it just
no, you,
where is it? Where is it like today? Is it
no,
just like
you're,
hidden
uh,
and cloistered off in the basement, or like has it
well,
been
yeah.
relabeled? What's the story with that?
See, King Crocoduck, if you listen to our debate, he too accused me of conspiratorial ideas. And I'm not talking about a conspiracy like the Masonic order went in with a group of Jehovah's Witnesses. I'm not talking about that sort of thing. I'm just saying that in the period of time in the early 1800s, when a flood model was considered a legitimate alternative to an old Earth, or the idea of evolution wasn't fully developed when we get to 1820, but still it was in the minds of people like Darwin's relatives and so forth. My only point is that John Mackay has done the research on this fossil that was found by British geologists. I don't know when, I don't have that memorized, but they took the fossil to the British Museum in the time before the Darwinian idea became prominent. It was on display in the British Museum as an example of a antediluvian human that had been fossilized in the Caribbean. In Mackay's research, he's found photographs, and it's clear that up until, I don't know, 1860 or something, this was on display. And when he himself traveled to London and asked the curators about it, they said, oh, yeah, a lot of those old things from the mid 1800s, we've taken them down. They've been replaced by modern, and they're down in the basement. That's the story, Grayson.
Okay, so it's just sort of like it's kind of fallen into obscurity, and nobody really has it's possibly in this basement, but it hasn't really been described in like a modern context. Because I mean, there were a lot of things that we were not aware of in the 1800s, and a lot of museum exhibitions that I'm sure would not be accurate to re-exhibit today that were from the 1800s, because we know a lot more, especially with like different types of hominins and different human like related like ancestors. So I'm curious how, if that would still be classified as Homo sapien today, or if that was, if there's any sort of reading I can do on this human specimen from the 1800s.
Yeah. Now, Donnie can, in private, provide you with John Mackay's email address in Australia. I don't even know if it's private. Maybe you have it at your desk, Donnie. I don't know. But you can contact Mackay, and I owe him a call to wish him Merry Christmas. I'll bring it back up with him. It's an issue that I would like to return to. I need to take a 5-minute break myself, Donnie, if I may, and get another cup of coffee. Grayson, it's been wonderful to talk to you, and I'll turn it over to Donnie. If you'd drop my feed, I will come back in 5 minutes.
Okay, David McQueen. Once you get back, I've got a lot of questions saved as well for you to answer in our final 30 minutes. I do appreciate this first hour and 15 minutes. So time always flies by. So there you go. Feed is dropped. Professor McQueen. Grayson, I guess I'd have an interesting question for you. It would be based on the biblical starting point. I'd be curious as to your thoughts. The Bible essentially says, and we've debated separate ancestry now 3 times, about 9+ hours worth of debate. So I do recommend people check that out. But when it comes to not just the ordering of the fossil record, but why don't we really find human fossils pre-flood in the fossil record? Because we find a lot of fossils post-flood, right? Neanderthalensis, Erectus, Floresiensis, Naledi, Heidelbergensis. We find all of these human fossils, but we find them in layers above the Cenozoic, essentially, and therefore would be considered post-flood. Probably the result of post-Babel migration and the dispersal of people groups that became isolated and eventually buried to the point where we can find them today. But my question would be, would we logically expect to find many human fossils in pre-flood rocks, given the fact that Genesis tells us that God created 2 people, Adam and Eve? And so humans would have started as 2 people. But then the Bible is pretty clear that God created countless animals, millions and millions, one could say billions of animals around the globe at that time, which I would argue was a one world continent, the pre-flood one world continent. And so we would have millions of animals, but only 2 people basically at creation. And 2,000 years later at the flood, we would expect a lot of animals and only few people, especially when compared to the animals. So in the fossil record, we would expect to find what? Billions of fossilized animals, but little to no humans. It would be like trying to find a needle in a haystack. It would really depend on where we're looking. It would depend on the mindset of who's looking, right? So any thoughts on that specific point, Grayson?
Yeah, I mean, don't you, as part of your model, have to think that the human species got down to like what, 8 individuals after the flood, like with Noah and his sons and their wives? So then, and 2,000 years, if you're saying is the distance between Adam and Eve and then the flood, if we look at 2,000 years after Noah, that's like almost around the time of Jesus, and the world population then um, was certainly, pretty significant to at least have left behind bones. And so that's this, given the same time frame of the 2,000 years, just like in your same model. So I think that you could grow, especially, if you have a lot of abundant resources, like Adam and Eve probably would around Eden, then you'd think that they'd be able to grow a population. I mean, you can, increase increase exponentially on a population scale per generation. So, yeah, I think like that the 2,000 years, I mean, it would be plenty. I mean, McQueen was just talking about potentially billions or like a billion of people pre-flood. So I don't know what the consensus is in the creationist community, but I don't really see an issue with 2,000 years not being long enough to build up a significant population to leave behind fossils.
So that's a good question and some good points. So we have creation. God creates Adam and Eve. And what follows the creation of Adam and Eve is rapid and exponential population growth, right? So in each biblical creation bottleneck, the creation event, the flood, and the Tower of Babel, which was in a way a bottleneck event, they were each one generation. So they were one generation bottlenecks, and they were followed by rapid and exponential population growth. And so after the flood, we for sure would have had a rapidly expanding population. Now that population would have been isolated because they did not spread out just yet until the Tower of Babel, when God confused their languages. Then they spread out into different parts of the globe. Okay, and that's where we can get into allele frequencies and Y chromosomal DNA difference distribution, things like that, which we have touched on to determine the validity of the Babel story in the Bible. But here's my point: is in the pre-flood world, although we start with an expanding population, once we get to the time where the Bible describes the pre-flood world as being incredibly degenerate, wicked, it has now descended into wickedness. And it talks about the world at that time being filled with violence, and the thoughts of every single man were wicked. That would tell me that the violence, the murder, the wickedness at that time might have made for a very small population. So it depends, I guess, on your creationist starting point or model in terms of the flood itself. Once you reach the flood, the human population could have been down to as little as 100 million, which definitely would be like looking for a needle in a haystack, especially if you have billions of animals essentially all over the planet in the pre-flood world. And then humans could have even been isolated in certain parts wherever their civilization is. So for me, it makes me wonder, at least starting from the Bible, where it talks about the pre-flood world being wicked, which is why God had to destroy it in the first place. And it says every single thought of man was wicked. And so to me, that might suggest the population was rather low. I mean, that would say people were not fulfilling God's command to be fruitful and multiply. So at that point, the rapidly growing population probably stopped. And if there was a lot of murder, violence, and wickedness, then that could have reduced the population as well. So I think it does come down to, and Grace, and I said a lot there, so I definitely want to get your thoughts before Professor McQueen comes back. So if you hold to a position, which I believe I would, where you have a population that isn't in the billions, that's maybe closer to 100 million. And so those people are buried. But then you also have billions of animals buried. We would expect today little to no human fossils, but a great multitude of animal fossils. And that's exactly what we find. So anyways, Grayson, what are your thoughts on that overall?
Yeah, I mean, the population for apex predators is never going to be approaching like, even hundreds of millions of numbers. Like apex predators, like a small number of them can exist over a large geographic territory, like big cats or something. You're never going to have like a huge, like 100 million number of like big cats or apex predators like T-Rex, and yet we find fossil evidence of apex predators all the time. I think 100 million or something, or even a few million humans is still plenty enough to leave behind evidence in the fossil records, which we don't really find for any of these layers below the Cenozoic, as you guys are putting the flood at. And then I would just say, like, like, if I was hearing lots of corruption and wickedness and violence, I mean, all the places with the highest amounts of all those aspects are urban, like cities. That's where the highest murder rates are. That's where the most corruption and crime and all that stuff is in cities, which would imply a larger population. I mean, the Bible uses a lot of kind of similar ideas to talk about Sodom and Gomorrah at later points, describing them as pretty wicked too. So you have to have um, a decently high population to be able to have these big sinful cities and everything. So
I, I would argue that the nature of the flood, where you have, let's say it's about 100 million human beings at the time, mixed with the billions and billions of animals, that's where the needle in a haystack comes into play. Because if you have just a tiny percentage of life on the earth at that time being humans, and just the greater portion, and that's why in the fossil record we mostly find marine organisms anyways.
but you're not addressing my point with the apex predators, which I said would not be in the billions or millions. There'd be a much smaller amount of apex predators, and we still have the fossils for them.
Yeah, but which specific apex predator would you be talking about? I know you mentioned
Name any apex predator. Like you're not going to find any of them occupying the ecological niche of an apex predator at any large population numbers, like millions and billions.
well, and that's the thing. In the fossil record, we really don't find a huge portion of any of these higher mammals, these reptiles. I mean, even if you were to look at how many fossils we have of like Spinosaurus, it's really only a couple, and then they extrapolate everything from that couple. Megalodon sharks, I think we've only got a few teeth, and that's pretty much it. And that's all that would be fossilized, anyways. T-Rex, not really all that many, anyways. When you look at each case independently, there's not really a lot to even go by per species, and that would go for your apex predator as well. Go ahead.
I definitely think that you're like underselling it a little bit, but then at the same time, we still find all of these things. We don't find any like human fossils below the Cenozoic.
Professor McQueen, good to have you back. Me and Grayson decided to continue the discussion in your absence. So it's good to have you back ready. It looks like I hope you're ready to box Grayson and not.
Oh well, I
don't know. If I can take you on, Professor McQueen.
I got excited on my break and opened up my shirt to show the red blood, and here's the boxing gloves. So it's time to take the gloves off. They're even Everlast. Isn't that interesting? Time to take the gloves off and ask some hard-hitting questions in this final group, this final amount of time. Donnie, I want you to help me pace myself so that I think that I ordinarily take a 5-minute summary as I get toward the end. And are you looking to go all the way to the top of the hour here? So another 30 minutes?
Yeah, we could definitely go to the 2-hour mark, since we have been having a good discussion here. I want to wrap up my points on what I was saying, and then I want to give Grayson the final word there, and then we'll move on to either another point that you have, Grayson, for Professor McQueen, and then we'll also get to some of these questions that come in. So I would also argue that what you're going to find, let's just say we have a specific apex predator and its population is 100 million in the pre-flood world at the time of the flood, and then we have humans that are, let's say, at 100 million. Okay, well, why don't we find some human fossils, but we do find some of, name your favorite apex predator, right? So again, we have a lot of isolated bones, we have a lot of fragments, but it's going to depend on where these specific organisms were situated too. And I know, I'm not sure, I think Professor McQueen holds to a version at least of the ecological zonation model. And
Correct.
So so that would basically explain most of the fossil record as being burial of specific communities, being burial of specific ecosystems and habitats. Okay. And in the scriptures, it talks about how the land of Eden, we're told that a river flows out of Eden. Okay. So we understand that rivers flow downhill, and therefore we would understand that Eden was at a higher elevation. But then we also know that certain dinosaurs, other types of animals, they exist on lower elevations, right? We have some dinosaurs that live in swampy lowland areas. And so you have various animals, various communities and ecosystems that are living separate from man. So it might be like comparing apples and oranges if you want to look at humans versus name your favorite apex predator, because if it really is burial by ecosystems and communities, then we're not necessarily going to expect to find equal numbers of, let's say, human fossils as we would a Tyrannosaurus Rex fossil or some of these mammal predators. But anyways, Grayson, have the last word on that issue, and then we're going to allow you and Professor McQueen to go back and forth maybe one more time on one more point.
Yeah, okay. Well, if that were true, then there would be sort of hot and cold spots of like finding humans. Like you would find no human fossils in the areas that you're saying like the other animals live separately of humans, but then you would find areas where you would find the human fossils concentrated, like where they were living. You're saying that if this is like a, if the fossil record is the result of like that habitat and the community of organisms that were there, then we would expect to find those human communities somewhere on Earth. Which I mean, to point them out to me, I guess, because I'm not aware of them. And then just secondly, if that idea of, the habitats forming the fossil record was accurate, then how do you explain like where we have different habitats throughout geological time? So as you go higher up in the layers, you can go from like a desert or something to an ocean, to back to a land or like a forest or something, and you can see like the different plants and animals living there adjusting accordingly, but it's in the same spot. It's just the matter of depth. How could you explain that?
Okay, let me interject here, Donnie, my take on this apex predator line of discussion that you guys have had. And let me begin it, as I like to do things, with a simple example. I live in northeast Louisiana, many swampy areas. I have relatives that live in the New Orleans area. And in my work as a hydrogeologist for the Louisiana DEQ, I traveled statewide during my 26-year career. And so I have been to places that I know were very rich in alligators. I've never seen one walking across the road, but I've seen photographs of it. I have been fishing with my buddies, not a big fisherman, a fly fisherman is my hobby, a fairly unsuccessful one, I might add. So I've been around the block where there would be alligators. I myself have never been in the right place at the right time to have one come close to me. But here's the point I want to make to you, Grayson. I don't choose to live where I know there are a lot of alligators. And so it's not exactly an apex predator that I want to even know about. For example, I hope, other than photographs, I never see a tiger or never see a lion up front. I spent a month in Zimbabwe, the new name for Rhodesia. So I was around places that were lion habitat. I never saw one. I have hiked over the years in the Rockies and the Appalachians, but I've never seen a bear in the wild. I have a son that's seen more than one, but not me. And so, as far as the apex predator argument that you're giving, is I would say that most pre-flood humans, even if there were 100 million humans and 100 million apex predators of certain kind, I am quite confident that they would not have lived anywhere near to have been buried together. Now, I want to make one final point that Dr. Gary Parker has made to me over the last 40 years, and that's the issue of T-Rex. A lot of the argument, and let's forget about Hollywood for a moment, and their depiction of Jurassic Park and all that kind of stuff. Let's just talk about the fossil evidence for T-Rex. A lot of the argument for their predation is based on their teeth. Well, if you look at some very wicked looking animals like vampire bats, for example, what do they use their teeth for? Do they bite into humans and suck our blood? No. What they do is they attack mangoes and other fruits, and they use their teeth to get them out. Gary Parker has made the point over the years that if T-Rex really were to bite into you, all you'd have to do is pull away as a human, and his teeth were so shallowly cemented in his skull, you'd probably jerk his teeth out. Any of that ring true to you, Grayson?
Well, the first point I feel as if though I already addressed in my last speaking part where I was saying that because Donnie was the one that was saying that humans and the apex predators would live in different places. Although I will say I just brought up apex predators as a point of saying we do find apex predators that, like in the fossil record, I was showing that by comparison to human fossils, which we don't find below the Cenozoic, and to say that. Apex predators also existed in the low population numbers because that was what Donnie was explaining the absence of fossils with. But aside from the fact of that was how apex predators originally was brought up, with your point and what I addressed last time was saying that you would find hot and cold patches. Like some areas you'd find more apex predator fossils, and some areas you would find more human fossils. But that's not what we find. We find the apex predators in the pre-Cenozoic layers, but we don't find the human fossils. So that's why I'm saying that just saying that they're segregated over geological areas doesn't explain what we're actually finding in the fossil record, which is just that there's no humans in the pre-Cenozoic layers. And then to your points about teeth, I would just ask, how do you explain like fossils of dinosaurs with like their stomach contents fossilized with, lizards or smaller dinosaurs, like in the stomachs of larger dinosaurs? Like, we can see some of the things that they ate actually preserved in the fossil record.
Okay, let me respond to that. Take the gloves off and we can duke this out, because what you're pointing out is actually clearly wrong in the sense of how logically you should think about this. Let's take your final point there. It is true that for example, Dinosaur National Monument that I've visited over the years and studied about in my geology field work, in environments like that where there are tremendous numbers of rapidly buried dinosaur fossils, the burial is so rapid and so exquisite that you can see the contents of their stomach. And so now I'd like to turn that argument back around on you and say, okay, evolutionary scientist, explain to me then, are you trying to say that this dinosaur laid there for 1,000 years and was buried, and we see no evidence of decay? We don't see any degradation of those stomach contents. You and Donnie know far more about the population genetic sides of things, and so I'll defer to him on some of his arguments. But one thing that he said that I have to study more about is I just can't imagine that if the pre-flood human population was 100 million, that there might be 100 million of these apex predators around also. Now, Donnie, perhaps I misunderstood what you were saying. Did I?
I think, and Grayson, you can clarify. I think I was just assuming for sake of argument, because Grayson was saying, well, if the human population was low during the pre-flood world, let's say 100 million, and that's one of the reasons why we don't really find any human fossils. It's like finding a needle in a haystack. He then compared that to an apex predator that maybe exists as 100 million in terms of population. Well, why do we find fossils of that specific apex predator and not humans? Is that right? Is that an accurate representation, Grayson?
Yeah, and I would think that 100 million would still be on the really large end of the spectrum for apex predator populations, because you have to remember, humans can have a large population because of agriculture. We grow our food, but an apex predator is dependent on just the local animals around them and what they can hunt. And so it's really, you can sustain a much, much smaller population. But we find them all the time in the fossil record.
Well, one thing I want to say is, though, we don't want to make the assumption, the uniformitarian assumption, and Professor McQueen, you can expand on this if you want. When we looked at ecosystems today, and communities today that exist on this planet. Remember, the entire real estate of the earth was completely changed at the time of the flood. And so ecosystems and habitats and communities in the pre-flood world would be totally different than what we see today. And so if you're seeing a specific apex predator in a population today and you're looking at its ecosystem that it exists in, that doesn't necessarily mean that's how it's going to be in the pre-flood world as well. So the burial by ecosystems and communities from the pre-flood world would be different than the ecosystems and communities that we see today. Does that make sense?
Okay, so then what about for something like, to return to a previous example, phytoplankton, where they have to be like in the ocean somewhere in water, but they have to be close enough to the surface to get sunlight. That's what makes them phytoplankton. And we
Right.
find so many fossils of phytoplankton in the fossil record that there's just not enough room on the surface area of the earth. If it was a global flood and it was all covered in water, there's not enough room like within those first few meters of like the sunlight's penetration into the ocean for all of those phytoplankton that we see in the fossil record. They would, overcrowd the oceans even on a completely flooded world.
Donnie, I have a suggestion. Why don't we let Grayson take a 5 minute break and get some water? And you go ahead and give me one of the questions that has come in from either your brain, you said you had some questions, or the audience. And then Grayson and I can come back to it in 5 minutes.
And Grayson, I appreciate you joining for this open mic and having a solid 45-minute discussion on the ordering of the fossil record. Maybe we'll get a specific debate one day between you and Grayson or even myself.
Yeah, I would enjoy that.